Let me just start with a few starter questions. Starting with Richard, tell us about this class that I guess you co-taught with Aaron, right?
Sure, Aaron and I and another graduate student, Neil Tongri, co-taught the class. And let me just start by saying, I think it's a truism for many students at Stanford that they come to Stanford because they see it as a place where they can get an education, they can have access to educational opportunities and make connections that will enable them to have an impact, to live lives of consequence. And Aaron and Neil and I really buy into that vision, and we wanted to create a class for this very engaged group of students who are very committed to environmental causes in order for them to have the foundation, both from the climate science perspective, the policy perspective, the ethics, the justice, understanding some of the nuances of the financial mechanisms going into mitigating emissions. We wanted to have that broad context. In addition to that, we wanted them to have some experience with what the negotiations were actually like.
And so, of course, you had to go to Paris.
Well, we had to go to Paris, but we did a mock COP on campus, which in some really uncanny ways presaged some of the outcomes of that agreement. But then going to Paris, given the fact that the meeting itself is just overwhelming, that there's this 100-ring circus of side events, we needed students to have a focus. And so all the students designed research projects and then implemented those out in Paris, and then came back in January and presented on those research projects. And perhaps we might talk about some of those later on. So the third part, I would say, is a communications perspective. So all students posted blogs, some of them created videos, podcasts, and every student was required to write an op-ed, many of those which were published in the hometown newspaper. So there was that communications component. And then I think I also want to just pay a little bit of honor to Steve Schneider and to Terry Root, who back in 2009 taught a class which inspired our efforts, in which they took a delegation of students to Copenhagen for the COP15.
Well, if you were going to take a bunch of students to observe the international sausage making in action, you picked a good one, because apparently something actually came out of it. And so let's turn to Katie to talk about that a little bit. The Paris Agreement, high hopes, high expectations coming from it, keeping warming below 2 degrees Celsius, this number that keeps coming up, maybe aiming for even less. But you talk about a gap between the aspirations and the actions we're actually seeing. What do you mean by that? Like we don't know.
Great. So yeah, what is this Paris Agreement and where does it get us and why do we still have some work to do? So after 21 years of climate negotiations, the governments of the world came up with the first truly universal climate treaty. And its ambitions are truly breathtaking, limiting warming well below 2 degrees Celsius, ideally 1.5. And that's breathtaking because in 2015, temperatures eclipsed 1 degree Celsius, and in February,
we're halfway there, right?
1.5.
Yeah.
So we see impacts already, and there's a strong acknowledgement that we need to be ambitious about them. The structure of Paris is a series of country pledges. Over 180 countries have put forward pledges covering 95% of emissions. But where do all of these pledges on the table get us? Are we ready to pop the champagne and say we're at 2 degrees Celsius? Not quite. So if you take all of these country pledges and try to say, where might they get the world? They give us a much better chance of avoiding the worst impacts of climate change, temperature increases above 4 degrees Celsius, but they're very far from locking in 2 degrees Celsius, much less 1.5. They might be something more like a 3-degree world. And that 3-degree world has some very severe impacts in it, and it also gives us a much bigger potential for surprises, things we really can't grapple with. What are those potential surprises? A 3-degree world has high risk of Greenland melting, and that's 21 feet of sea level rise over centuries. Also, the West Antarctic would be at risk. Things like coral reefs being really hammered this year would be substantially at risk, along with places like Venice. And there would be a huge amount of unfairness in terms of food security impacts for those most on the margin and water insecurity impacts. So moving forward, the question is really, how do we get from where we are right now to a world that is aggressively implementing solutions towards well below 2 degrees Celsius, ideally 1.5.
And just this morning, we heard from NOAA that the month of March was the 11th consecutive month setting record high temperatures globally, and I believe was the record breaking month in terms of by how much it exceeded the 20th century average temperature or something like that. So it's a really timely discussion. We also have 100 and some odd countries coming to New York at the end of the week to sign this agreement that was made in Paris. And then, of course, it has to be implemented by all of the signatories. Everybody has to do their part. Aaron Strong, how about the U.S.? Are we doing our part? We've got a big clean power plan that's now held up in the courts. Where's this heading?
So each one of the countries that submitted their pledges pledged to do a set of domestic actions that will achieve emissions reductions. And in the United States, the cornerstone of our domestic action that was part of our pledge is the Clean Power Plan, which is supposed to reduce emissions by 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. And that's just one component of the whole suite of policies, but it is certainly the cornerstone. It doesn't actually even quite get us there. So the current policies that are in place or on the books or are expected in the United States don't quite get us to the pledge that we made, but they get us pretty darn close, and I think there's a lot of reason for optimism. So let's set aside the question of the stay for a second, the stay being the sort of potential halt in the implementation of the Clean Power Plan. We just heard from Katie that not all of these pledges don't get us all of the way there in terms of the temperature changes that we need to see in terms of the temperature rise that we're experiencing. But what Paris did, and what's really exciting and is a reason to celebrate this Friday when everyone comes together, is that we have a framework, we have a process. And included in that process is a process for increasing ambition over time. So there's actually a set of mechanisms, a 5-year stock take to see where do all these pledges get us and what more can be done, and then a re-pledging process that's going to happen. And that all sounds esoteric, it sounds boring UN speak, and as our students learned when Richard and I took them, it is boring UN speak, but it's a huge component of the success of Paris is not so much the pledges that we have now, but the ability to ratchet up, or ratchet down, I guess, if you're securing something. Ratchet down ambition, ratchet up ambition, I think over time is a better way to say it.
Ratchet down emissions.
Ratchet down emissions over time. And so for the United States, that would mean what comes next. And a key component of that is clearly the direction that we're going to get from the next presidential election, and I think it's fair to say that. So the Supreme Court matters, right? We hear this in the news, and the context in which it matters is whether or not this cornerstone of our emissions pledge is going to stay on the books. And I'm sure Michael can talk more about that. But I want to convey the message that even though we see these numbers over 2 degrees, and even though the last few months have been so high in terms of the temperature that it seems overwhelming that we can't get there, there's reason to think that the context and the process and the structure that we get from Paris allows us to move forward from where we are now.
And when we talk about, I think probably most of the people in this audience already know this, but when we talk about these 2 degrees, we're talking about degrees of warming compared to what they call pre-industrial times, which is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And as we pointed out, we're halfway there, right? We've already run through one of the 2 degrees of wiggle room, and we've only got one left to go, right? So, Michael Wara, the World Resources Institute this week, they keep a scorecard and all of this stuff, as I'm sure you're aware, noted 500 separate agreements since Paris that were at the sort of corporate and subnational level. And this probably predates Paris, I'm not sure, but such as, the city of San Diego saying, we're going 100% renewable energy by 2035. Or Jerry Brown's Under 2 MOU, that he's coordinating, all of these different subnational entities to sign pledges. What's the value of all this?
Well, I think there's an important role to play for kind of small-scale action in the process of in Aaron's words, ratcheting up ambition, ratcheting down the targets. In the developed world especially, in terms of showing what's possible, showing how a metropolis like San Diego can create wealth and jobs and a wonderful environment in which to live, while at the same time avoiding the impacts of climate change. One of the things that I think has changed most dramatically in the negotiations is the sense that, 5 years ago at Copenhagen, or I guess it was 7 years ago, wow, time flies, or even going back to Kyoto, the sense that, this is going to cost a lot of money and it's going to be a drag on the economy. I think there's a lot more question about that, a lot more hope that the solutions to climate change are going to be things that we actually really want to do that create value for society, create value for companies. And so the role for local action, I think, is substantially in demonstrating proof of concept, right? Showing how to do it. That's going to give comfort to the nation states that eventually have to make these commitments to ratchet up ambition, to take a bigger risk, to go further than they might otherwise feel comfortable going.
And do you see this happening already?
Absolutely, yeah. I think
this trickle up sort of.
Yeah, well, I think California is a great example of that, and the actions that California has taken on, especially on electricity policy, have had a tremendous impact on what the other states in the United States view as feasible and possible, and also in terms of what the EPA and ultimately the federal government thinks can be done within the context of the U.S. electricity sector, and can be done at a cost that doesn't create its own distributional problems, right? Doesn't harm doesn't impose the cost of climate change on the least well-off among us, which isn't going to be acceptable here, just as it's not going to be acceptable at a global basis, on a global basis.
Getting back to the transnational, the Paris Accord, doesn't even take effect, right, until we get 55 countries accounting for at least 55% of global emissions on board with this thing. And the US and China together are like 40%, right? I'll throw this up as a jump ball, but what happens if we do have a presidential election coming up? What happens, because this is not like a formal, traditional kind of treaty that is being ratified by the Senate, what happens if the next president just decides to change his mind or her mind and back out of this thing? You want to address that?
I mean, I guess or did you want to go first?
After you.
Okay. I mean, I guess what I would say is that there are a lot of different ways to think about why countries are taking action on climate change, and I might just step back to a slightly more global view and then come back to the US. I think historically it's really been about shame and blame, and let's point fingers at the largest historical emitter, the US, or the current biggest emitter, China, and say, it's your problem, take care of it. And I think that shame and blame approach has had some really important value, but I think increasingly we see different models emerging, and maybe the surprise in the Paris run-up was the degree to which leadership emerged, and China and the US stepped forward together to really drive the process. They came out with incredibly ambitious announcements together in 2014 and implemented all sorts of behind-the-scenes activity to make Paris happen. At the same time that there is another mode of action, and that really was what Michael emphasized, this co-benefits approach, really recognizing that China can say, we're going to take action over the next 2 decades, not because of climate, but because climate is so tied to air quality that these are 2 issues we can completely conflate and go drive them together. Same for India. So I think in the US, we're a little bit hung up right now in that we are the last nation on the planet that has a hold of skepticism in our legislative branch, and that's pretty tricky to think about how we get around that factor. In Paris, we saw the Obama administration, State Department come together with every trick they could pull out in terms of existing legislation, what the president could do by himself, to put forward a very ambitious pledge. Moving forward, the US will continue to need to be a leader, and presidential action is important, but I think also what US citizens do, what California does, what Reggie does, what private sector does, will help put pressure on the entire governance system to keep us in a leadership mode and not a dragging our feet mode.
Aaron?
Okay, I was just going to add one slightly different point, which is that I think that in isolation, it's much more conceivable that a president-elect who feels more skeptical about the importance of climate change might move to kind of step back from this treaty, kind of do a Kyoto 2.0, right? Fooled me once, fooled me twice, we'll say the international community. But the thing is that our relationship, especially with our most important bilateral relationship with China, is not just about climate change. And so that president, whoever he or she is going to have to think about the damage that will occur to other aspects of the relationship, that bilateral relationship, our relationship with the EU, if the US backs away from an issue which these countries feel is very important, that they feel differently about. And the reality is that the US commitments are ambitious, but they are not incredibly ambitious. They're nothing like the commitment we made at Kyoto in terms of the ambition. And the US will have to weigh, for example, how it feels about damaging what is already a very fragile relationship with China over something like this that's actually not going to be that expensive, that hard to achieve.
So you're confident that the Trump White House will already be contemplating its legacy?
What I would say is I think that the Trump White House will face a difficult set of trade-offs. I mean, this view really, for me, comes from conversations with members of the former George W. Bush White House, and talking to them about how they view the current diplomatic situation and how a move to kind of repeat what President Bush did with respect to Kyoto would be incredibly costly in the current environment for not nearly the same level of benefit, right? The transformation that's happening in our electricity sector is going to happen. It's happening now. In the words of one renewable developer I know, he said, RPS has lit the bonfire, but now it's completely out of control. And so the question is, do we help that fire to spread a little bit faster, or do we try to stop it? And what are the external costs in terms of our relationships around the South China Sea?
RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standard, the
Yes.
sort of minimums that are being put in place in various states and everything about how much renewables you need to have. That's a perfect segue, by the way, into a question that I had for Aaron, which is, you do hear people say sometimes, the politics may be moving slowly, but the technology is moving rapidly. And so technology is ultimately going to save us from ourselves, from our political sloth, from whatever, and bail us out of this climate mess. Aaron?
Sure, and I was just going to add one thing to not be too worried about the upcoming presidential election. We have an endangerment finding for greenhouse gases. We have greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. There are many things that a presidential administration could do to hold back the reins, to not allow us to move forward, to ratchet up ambition, but it's not going to be as simple as striking out everything that's been built and done institutionally within the federal government around greenhouse gases over the last decade. In answer to your question, amidst all this kind of terrible news, terrifying news about 1 degree increase already and the warmest months on record, there's been some other news that's come out recently about the beginnings of the decoupling between GDP growth and greenhouse gas emissions. That's really exciting, right? And technology is certainly a part of that. The rate at which renewables are being deployed is exciting. The rate at which costs are coming down is exciting.
And it's happening fastest in developing countries.
And I was just going to say, to Dr. McNutt's point about leapfrogging technologies in developing countries is one of the key needs for moving forward. And how do we, engage in technology transfer? How do we engage in policies for technology innovation in developing countries? This is absolutely key to doing what you described, which was saving us. Now, I do want to put in a caveat here, which is that I'm not sure I know what saving us means. If saving us means doing that decoupling or avoiding dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system and equating that to 2 degrees, technology is a major, necessary but not sufficient condition to achieving that. We heard from Stacy in the introduction about knowledge to action. And technology and engineering was one component of what needs to be understood in this relationship between knowledge and action. Natural capital was another, and social systems and institutions is a third. So in the students that we took to Paris, all of them went in there thinking, this is simple. We just need to convince everyone to do the right thing, right? We just need to convince everyone to come up with the policies and solutions that will save the planet, right? And then you had a whole bunch of reasonable people, all of whom are committed to environmental action of some form or another, disagreeing fundamentally about whether Paris was a good thing or a bad thing, about what actions were deemed acceptable or not acceptable for a whole variety of different values. You know, if we have our single metric of greenhouse gas emissions or temperature rise, then that's one form of analysis. But we also need to think about justice and equity and gender responsiveness and all the other things that we want in this future world, right? And there are a lot of disagreements about what kinds of technological innovations we're talking about. And I think there are a lot of people that our students met in Paris, that were there in Paris, who don't necessarily think that the latest, coolest clean tech technology being at the forefront of the solution space is really going to help them with, you know, off-grid solar in Bangladesh. And I think if we link technology too much to a sort of focus on consumption, we risk understanding the sort of key roles that it can play. So it's an interplay between knowledge and action, science and policy, technology, policy, and institutions and social systems, and it all has to work together.
Okay, knowledge to action. I'm just curious, are some of the students that were on that Paris trip probably with us today in the audience? Is anybody out here who was on that trip? Okay, so this question applies to everybody, though. Raise your hand if you came away from the Paris Agreement still skeptical that a significant international action is going to happen. And raise your hand if you were like really encouraged and optimistic that it's going to happen. So I think the nays have it, based on our informal straw poll here. So Richard, what do you tell your students about, to the extent that I imagine many of them are on science, you know, are going into the science realm as opposed to, say, the policy realm. I'm not sure what the mix is, but what do you tell them, let's say those of them who are on a science trajectory, about their role as scientists versus communicators versus activists?
You know, I think a lot of our students feel that the question is really about what kind of science needs to be done. And I'm going to turn this question over to Erin in a moment. But I think they're also thinking about how can they engage in policy, how can they do science that informs policies, how do you actually do science that informs action is one aspect. The other aspect is that, you know, and to Erin's point about if you're going to use technology as a solution, how do you do that in a way that does not deliver unintended consequences to adversely impact women in Africa where these technologies are deployed? Who owns the technology? To what extent do populations are going to be participating in the benefits? Supposedly the benefits of this technology have ownership. So I think it's in considering how you actually deploy these solutions in the places in which they're going to be deployed and thinking about those aspects. So when we think about success versus failure, I think for our students, many of them, they're grateful that there was an agreement, but they're also anxious, alarmed that there's this urgent issue that we have not yet solved. And I think Katie addressed some of the ways we can get to that. But for them, you know, Erin talked about some of the nuanced views about success versus failure. I think for many of our students, this problem is so urgent because, frankly, they're the ones who are going to have to be bearing the cost of this more than a lot of people in this room.
What about this tricky balancing act between science and activism, though? I mean, like, say, the leap that James Hansen has taken. What do your students think about that?
I think that many of them admire it. I think many of them wish that more scientists were activists. I mean, they actually, I think, frankly, speaking for myself, their activism is inspiring. To watch how they're trying to do what they can with the means and the tools that they have to take action. So they have the knowledge. They're trying to put it into action in the ways that they can impact change.
We're getting pretty close to the time when we want to get you all involved. And I think the magic red pigeonhole iPad, which strayed earlier, is back in the. I just want to remind you how to get involved if you haven't already. We're using this pigeonhole technology. You can go to the website, which is shown there, pigeonhole.at, and you can enter this event passcode, DOTS, 41916, and then you'll be able to submit questions on any device that you have that's tied to the internet. I got to take just a second here and look, see what we want to go with first. because I know I'm supposed to hit something really quick. How about this one? Because it was on my mind too, you know. Is the Paris Agreement too little too late? We kind of talked about that a little bit, but it just seems to me this is a huge lift, you know, that we're talking about here, and precious little time to do it in. Or is it the start of a new era, the questioner asks, and when will we know? That's the best part of the question, I think. Katie?
Okay, I wrote this question, so this is
Okay, that's cheating. Next question.
I'm very happy to take this question. So, what I'd say is that we've got a closing window for ambitiously limiting warming. If we look at the carbon budget available for limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius, it's about 2 decades of emissions at current levels. So we could get really depressed, but we could probably be more effective in taking an optimistic view.
Too late.
The Paris Agreement really is a profound starting point for climate action going forward. And in some ways, the challenge is simple if you make it technical. We just need to get to the point where clean energy is the good stuff. Right now, we feel like we need to cling to coal and oil and natural gas. But in some ways, that's kind of a silly mindset in that we're not that far from a world where clean energy in many places is just cheaper than coal or natural gas. We're not far from recognizing that in many places, renewable energy is already cheaper once you encompass the air quality impacts, the health impacts, what happens to asthma in kids when you have coal plants going. So there's so many ways where we can just say, let's transform clean energy into the good stuff, and that involves companies taking action, it involves ambitious city action, it involves country-level action. All those pieces to come together needs to happen fast over the next few decades, but I think we have a lot to look forward to.
So what we've always heard about this tipping point. I guess nobody really knows what that is or when it happens, but you think we're not there yet.
I object to the framing of a single tipping point. What I'd say is that with increasing magnitudes of warming, we're looking at a lot of potential for surprises and for changes that are going to be really hard to unravel. Some of those tipping points that are really important to consider, we actually see unfolding already. This year is the 3rd year on record where we're having a global bleaching event for coral reefs. So they're a little bit boutique. They're about biodiversity in the ocean, and not everyone would care about them, but that's a pretty massive impact unfolding at the global scale. We also have science unfolding rapidly in terms of what's happening with our ice sheets. And there's some indications that part of the West Antarctic, which could lead to many feet of sea level rise, parts of that ice sheet may have already tipped, so that even if we were to drive down emissions, that sea level rise will proceed over the next few centuries. So there are many points for people, ecosystems, communities around the world where we may not be able to undo those changes. There will be losses. But I think in terms of a tipping point for planet Earth, it gets back to Aaron's question of what are we saving? I think that's maybe a little bit too broad of a framing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's see if we can find a question that Katie did not write. Since we're talking about looking at this from an education perspective, and Richard, you probably say, I wrote that. Many science teachers, the questioner says, are not teaching their students that we are causing climate change. How do we address this problem? It's got to start a lot earlier than the college level, right? Clearly you did not write this question.
No, I didn't. I'm thinking, because this is a question I'm thinking a lot about. I think that...
And by the way, anyone else wants to jump in on any of this, please.
Yeah, please do. I think it's a broader question. I think there's a lot of question about what gets taught and what, as science in high schools. I think we're talking about high schools particularly, but we could be talking about middle schools. And I think that so much of this is decided on the state level. And I think some of this question is rooted to a coupling between the control of certain industries who are able to impact stakeholders in local educational systems and control the curriculum. And so I think they're very invested in continuing a campaign of disinformation. This is a much part of a much larger campaign. So I see it as partly coupled to that disinformation campaign that's being lobbied by groups like the Heritage Foundation, those types of groups who are providing these kinds of materials and who are encouraging through activating citizens, through providing citizens, and coupling climate change to issues of independence. I think is part of the issue. How do we change that conversation? I think some of the suggestions that Dr. McNutt made about showing that, for example, the co-benefits are an important way to do this. I think this is a challenging question. I think this really gets also at trying to find ways to communicate climate change that is resonant with people's values in the communities in which you find them. I think that's the greatest challenge. And that's a lot of work is being done by groups like Climate Nexus in order of how do you communicate climate change in ways that are resonant with people's values? If those values are for the well-being of their children, if those values resonate with independence, there are ways to do that. So I think you have to find those connection points in showing how climate change is resonant with those local values.
Anybody else want to weigh in on the education aspect of this?
I'll just add one thing. There's a student here at Stanford named Casey Bush, who's a colleague of mine, and she's actually done a really careful study of the treatment of climate science in textbooks in use in pre-college education. And whenever non-climate science is discussed, it's simply stated as fact, and the scientists are not actually present in the narrative. And then when climate science is discussed, it says, scientists think that. The climate may be, and there's a lot of this language in which scientists are thinking, and that this may be, and none of it's wrong. In many cases, scientists do think that, right? And there are some uncertainties in what's happening to the climate, but it's the differential treatment. And this can be traced, I think, at least in my opinion, to some of the politics around climate change. So I think this question is inseparable from the politics, and the solutions are so varied, and they involve the research of social scientists and humanists alongside scientists. And I think that's one of the amazing things of what's happening here at Stanford is this increasing, I'm supposed to represent the interdisciplinary perspective, so here goes. Everyone has something to say about climate change and should be involved in the conversation.
Yeah, years ago, we talked about individual action a lot, and I wonder about that, because years ago, Bill McKibben, had 360.org, one of the highest profile agitators for climate policy in the country, wrote an article, I think it was for Wired magazine, basically saying, look, you can change all the light bulbs you want, it's really not going to make a difference. The only individual action that makes a difference is getting on your legislator's case, because the only thing that's going to really affect change is sweeping, high-level policy actions. Anybody agree or disagree with that specifically, Richard?
I'll have a few thoughts. First of all, I get frustrated by these. I invite other people to weigh in here. I get frustrated by these arguments that we can make a lot of change through individual action. That's great and that's important, and there's a lot of great examples of people doing that and showing how it can be done. And also I want to kind of pull the conversation a little bit away from focusing just on developing countries, because I think it's easy for us to say, we can encourage other countries to leapfrog, but yet, when you look at the historical emissions and who is responsible, we really need to look at, maybe a lot of our ancestors contributed to the increases in carbon dioxide, and maybe we didn't cause that, but we still have a responsibility, and we have a responsibility to look at how we're living and to reduce consumption. So I think there's a very strong argument to be made there, and we need policy solutions, we need economic incentives to carbon tax, carbon fees. We need those types of incentives to move change in that direction, but I don't think it's just enough to look at developing countries. We need to look at home. I think there are huge changes that we need to be making locally. And I also want to kind of go back to the question we addressed earlier for a moment, and I think it's that coupling of the very clear dangers of climate change with the link to solutions that is really, we talk about why people can't talk about this, because it's very hard to talk about problems in which you cannot see the solutions. And so I think that coupling of the solution and the problem, that knowledge to action is critical for whether you're in high school, whether you're in middle school, otherwise it's overwhelming, and otherwise you just turn it off. So collective action is incredibly important, whether it's at the political level. Michael talked about and actually Katie made a reference to the role of citizens. I see that activism is very, very important for holding politicians' feet to the fire and maintaining the pressure. Obama said back when there was legislation for gun control, we had 90% of people in favor of that, of more stringent rules on gun control. Yet even though we had that strong number of people in favor, it was the activists from the gun rights activists who were able to push legislators because they are able to hold legislators' feet to the fire. That's what matters, that activism, we had over 500,000 people in New York. Those types of actions matter. That's how our voices get heard, through that kind of collective action.
You've provided another good segue. Maybe our law professor would like to take this one on. Is there such a thing as climate justice? And if so, what is the role of justice in helping to address climate justice issues? What is the role of science? And
Is there such a thing as climate justice?
oh, good, he didn't write this one.
No, I did not write this one. I think there certainly is, and you can think about it in terms of along a number of dimensions, right? There's a question of fairness in terms of who contributes to the solution and how they make trade-offs in terms of contributing to the solution. There's this question of fairness in terms of who bears the full costs of the changes that we collectively have kind of unleashed through the global climate system, and the degree to which the people, the countries that have benefited from combusting all of this fossil fuel compensate those victims. These are things that are very much alive in the international conversation on climate change, and I wish I could say that they're sort of a central piece of the solution. I think that's not true yet. I think it's more accurate to characterize them as things that could blow up the negotiation, right? They're these kind of radioactive issues that need to be addressed in order to kind of de-escalate the concern. And there are a really difficult set of questions about how to address them, right? How do you address the claims that small island states might have due to the fact that the West Antarctic ice sheet is going to slip off its moorings and float away into the Southern Ocean? That's something that international law is not well equipped to deal with, but it's an issue that is not going to go away, given where we're heading. Even if we do, even if you chart the best case for where we go from here in terms of international cooperation.
There was some other good policy-oriented questions here, but I want to come back around to the science question. It's really fundamental, but I think really important, and that is, what are the leading scientific questions that need to be answered or settled in the next few years in order to really move forward with this? In other words, what don't we know that we still need to?
Great. I didn't write this question. So, I think in many ways, I might characterize there being several categories of priorities moving forward. The first is that climate change involves a lot of very complex risks unfolding through time. And why climate change poses danger is not just due to how climate is going to interact with societies, ecosystems around the world. So just essentially at the very periphery of our analytical capabilities, we have things that are going to be hard to deal with. It involves, for example, refugee crises and how they may be affected by extreme events. It involves the potential for violent conflict breaking out between nations, where we have increasing understanding that if you pump up the temperature or you create a really dry year, it increases that type of incredibly complex risk that is global in nature. So on the one hand, I think there are some very important questions about complex risks unfolding that we need to grapple with more effectively moving forward. And the other major category I would flag is that we are just beginning a whole new era on planet Earth where we will be experimenting with climate responses that have never been deployed and need to be deployed more rapidly than we've ever done before. We're going to be trying new things like, is natural gas a bridge to coal? Or what happens when there are leaks? How do we grapple with that very rapidly moving forward, measuring emissions at the same time that we're figuring out how to do effective capping? How do we think about deploying renewables while we're figuring out grid integration and management of those systems simultaneously? The world hasn't really deliberately tried to transform an energy system at a global scale ever, and this will be something where science will have a very important real-time role to figure out what's working and why. And the second part of science for solutions is around adaptation. How do we prepare for the impacts that are in the pipeline? And adaptation is so fundamentally far from a scientific era that I would say that it's actually really hard to even define what adaptation is in many cases, or what the potential for adaptation is. For crops, for example, there's in many of the models a huge potential for increasing yields right now. But it's an open question, the degree to which 10 years from now we'll be able to realize that potential, or will it always be hypothetical? And you step through almost every part of the human endeavor, there are fundamental questions about how we're going to become more prepared for the impacts we'll be seeing, and even what those impacts will be.
That's really interesting, because I've always thought of the adaptation side much more in terms of policy. But you're saying there's an important science part of this too. We don't even know in many cases what the adaptation should look like yet.
So what is adaptation? At the global scale, you could say that in many cases, adaptation is just good development. As countries become richer, health outcomes are better, there's better access to clean water, and people are more able to grapple with the variations in weather and climate that are going to unfold. Many times, adaptation is tied nicely to city-scale action, to companies. If you're well prepared for what's happening in your supply chain as a company, you're going to be financially better off. So I think there are important policy dimensions of adaptation, but there are also many questions about how do we deploy adaptation in a way that we can figure out how effective these different actions are, recognizing that they affect so many different aspects of human well-being.
And then getting back to the sort of the mitigation side, which is how do we stop this moving train? I take it from all that, we can't just dump a bunch of iron filings in the ocean and call it good. Aaron Strong, you want to weigh in on that?
What you're
I'm going to
referencing.
start by explaining what I just
Sure.
said.
What you're referencing is a geoengineering proposal called ocean iron fertilization, which the idea is that it could sequester carbon by putting iron into areas of the ocean that are high nutrient, meaning macronutrient, there's plenty of nutrients, but low phytoplankton biomass. And that if you could add iron to the surface of the ocean, which is a limiting nutrient, you'd stimulate a big bloom of phytoplankton, and because they perform photosynthesis just like trees, this would take CO2 out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis. And
What could possibly go wrong?
well, so here's the problem, and this is a great example, of some of the challenges around the nuances of science really being important, which is that photosynthesis, taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, is not carbon sequestration, right? Anytime it does take CO2 out of the atmosphere very temporarily, but if that carbon doesn't sink to the bottom of the ocean and no longer exchange with the atmosphere for hundreds of years, it's going to go right back into the atmosphere. You grow your lawn in the summer, maybe you don't water it, hopefully you have a xeriscaped lawn, but grass dies and decomposes and the CO2 goes right back to the atmosphere. That's not carbon sequestration. And so this idea was really advanced by a businessman who thought he could earn carbon credits by doing this. So being really careful around the details of the carbon cycle is really, really important as we're developing new policies around things like carbon offsets, around all of these carbon accounting regimes. This is actually an area of science in answer to this question that's really important. What are the leading scientific questions? One of the big issues in the next 5 years to be worked out in the UN is transparency, the rules for accounting. If you've read all of these INDCs, the intended nationally determined contributions, it's everything from like a short 5-page, really vague document to hundreds of pages of detailed text. The degree to which different countries have actually put in all the details around their emissions accounting is widely varying. That needs to be harmonized. We need to come up with the rules for how we're doing accounting, what counts as what. And there's some really key scientific questions, which by the way are also political questions that are embedded in that. So I personally am really concerned about the idea of just techno fixes that ignore fundamental science issues, and I'm happy to talk about ocean iron fertilization later.
I was one example. I mean, there are
Yes.
lots of ideas.
And so there are a lot of interest in geoengineering, and I think it's not right to just dismiss all interest in geoengineering. This is the flip side where I'm arguing with myself, and that because I think a lot of that interest comes from a point of absolute concern with the urgency of the problem, the need to do something now, and seeing what comes out of Paris as this, every 5 years we'll take stock and hopefully do better, as being too slow. And I think that in order to do any of this right, in order to vet anything, it just takes so much time and so much careful attention, and there's so many dedicated, wonderful, amazing researchers trying to do that. I think we just need to make sure we don't go into anything with a mentality of a quick fix or that this is an easy solution.
So before we move on, I just want to say two things. First of all, if I'm not getting to your question, it's probably because we may have touched on it already, touched on aspects of it already. And also, if there's anyone who's not using this technology and has a burning question, but their only way to do it is by a microphone, that is possible. So raise your hand if you're in that category, and we'll try to get a microphone to you. But on to the policy now, or on to the, Dr. McNutt said that we can solve this with policy. So what policy? What are some of the changes that will make the difference? Who wants to take that? Michael.
I'll take it. I think the legal authority that the United States has, that the U.S. Executive branch has to move forward with climate regulation under the Clean Air Act is a really important piece of policy that can be used to make significant change in the United States. We're just really beginning to use it. Moving forward with that is important, but it may be as important as in terms of creating motivation for Congress to ultimately pass legislation that does a better job, right? The Clean Air Act is kind of a square peg in a round hole when it comes to greenhouse gases. You can drive it in there if you work really hard. You can make a difference, but there are much better approaches like economy-wide cap and trade, what we talked about 6 or 7 years ago in the Waxman Markey legislation, and or a carbon tax. And figuring out which one of those is the right policy for the United States is going to be a question of politics, a kind of meeting of the minds on both sides of the aisle. That's not going to happen until we really are down the road with implementing the set of imperfect policies that we have. So I think we can solve this. I think there are a number of well-understood options for addressing the problem and really making deep transformative progress. But what we need to do right now is work with the tools that we have and push as hard as we can using those tools until we get to the place where the kind of legislative compromise that's going to be necessary is actually possible.
Meanwhile, coming back around to this sort of education aspect of this, Michael, looking at this up-and-coming generation of scientists and policymakers, frankly, what questions are they asking that have sort of opened your eyes? Or what things have emerged from your interactions with them to sort of give you a sense that this generation may be doing things a little differently?
Well, I think I think you were addressing that, you said Michael, but you were addressing that question to me.
I'm sorry, Richard.
So some of the things that I think have really opened my eyes, one of the most wonderful things about teaching this class with Aaron and Neil is the things that you learn from students. And so one of the insights that I had, when you go back and look at a lot of the build-up for the COP, one of the things that Christiana Figueres was saying was that the role of the subnational governments is going to be really important, especially in the next 5 years. And one of the things I learned from students that one student in particular, Josh Lappin, I don't know if he's here today, but he wrote a really amazing article. And one of the things he had an opportunity to do at the COP was to interview a lot of different people, mayors, the mayor of Stockholm. He was embedded with Governor Brown's delegation. He was able to look at the role of subnational governments in demonstrating and creating policy mechanisms that are helping to mitigate carbon and to get people to sign on to this under 2 MOU. Some of the reasons that people are signing on for that are really interesting, or that subnational governments are signing on to that is in order to kind of declare their own independence. So there's some really interesting things happening on the subnational policy scale that are really moving us forward. I think that was one of the things that really opened my eyes. I think the other thing I learned that really caught my attention was in terms of how you deploy these technological solutions in developing countries, how do you do that in ways that integrate systems thinking? In other words, take into consideration the impacts of those implementations on the people for whom they're supposedly going to be serving, and how do you take in their needs, their demands? How do you do that intelligently, in which you, like Aldo Leopold said, in which you keep all the parts to these solutions? So I think they are doing that kind of work. They're doing that work this summer. They're taking classes. There's another class on climate communication that a lot of our students are taking. They're writing articles that are probably, some of them will be picked up by Climate Central. So they're really passionate about trying to get the word out to people their age to come up with ways of communicating this. I think a lot of that effort is focused on how do we communicate this information in ways that will inspire and direct action. So I think they're thinking about lots of different ways of taking what they learned at the COP and finding solutions, but I think those are some of the things that I've learned have been really inspiring me for me to learn and how they're taking what they've learned.
And because there's a question here also about why it's so politicized in this country. It's seemingly so much more than elsewhere. Do your students look at that and say, what?
Yeah, that was one of the most interesting things. Again, I think it was either in a conversation that students expressed this shame that they felt about being from the U.S. and being among all these other countries in which, I mean, your Congress, like, what is wrong with your Congress?
Yeah.
And here they are, representatives of the U.S., and they have to carry this burden to Paris with them and carry that shame of not having a Congress that's taking on the role of leadership that they need to be taking. So absolutely.
And here we are, and our time is winding down. We have looks like about 5 minutes left. But here we are in the heart of Silicon Valley. So this seems like a good one to kind of start to wind up on, if I can get it to work. And that is, I can't get it to work. And that is, how can academia collaborate more closely with the private sector in coming up with effective solutions to the climate change challenge? Now, this could mean technology, or it could mean something else. I'll just throw that up as a jump ball. Who'd like to take that?
I think there's an important role to play, at least in the policy realm, in academia providing a neutral voice of expertise. You know, there are an enormous number of legal and regulatory questions that we're going to face as we move toward a cleaner energy economy, or even a clean energy economy. Things that come to mind right now are all the disputes around net metering that are occurring across the country at state PUCs. The discussion about whether to regionalize the California electricity market to include more of the western United States. These are really complicated questions. The typical advice that policymakers and legislators and regulators get is from interested parties. And so places like Stanford, where you can combine engineering with economics, with law, with public policy to provide sort of an integrated solution for policymakers that's also disinterested. Are places like that, and I think we're not the only institution that can do this, but we're one of the best, are really important. And there's a lot of value to provide and value to be created, both by offering advice to policymakers, also learning from policymakers about what the real questions are, so that when we offer advice, it's actually relevant.
Now, if I could just jump
Sure,
on that,
please.
I think another important aspect that academia offers is the education component. And that's also something that we're all doing here. We're all involved with to various degrees. And so training that next generation to be able to take on those challenges.
And for the immediate future, with the three minutes or so we have left, because I asked how many were skeptics. For the skeptics, and this did not come from me, for the skeptics about progress at COP21, please tell us what feasible and significant progress looks like. What concrete actions should be taken this year and should and can be taken, and specifically this year? Aaron Strong, you started.
Sure, I can just add a little bit. I'm sure Katie can jump in on this. If we're talking about the UN process itself, we have something called the Ad Hoc Working Group on the Paris Agreement, again in UN speak. And basically we're looking at 2018. By 2018 we can start to put together the rules so that we're on track for a stocktake mechanism. We have the transparency rules and the whole agreement doesn't fall apart, and there's a sense of a possibility of increasing ambition, and we get the institutional and governance frameworks in place in order to do that ratcheting up that we keep talking about. That's what needs to take place in concrete terms. The meeting starts next month. So there's no big break, there's no big leaving. Next month, countries of the world come together, and it's not the high-level ministers, it's the folks who are career bureaucrats coming together to try to hash this out so that everything can keep moving forward, and we, every 5 years, can keep increasing ambition. But that's going to take politicians and international relations and diplomacy around climate change becoming part of the mainstream that we're always talking about and always working on. So if you're looking for a few concrete steps, pay attention to what's happening leading up to 2018.
Katie, did you want to have the last word on this?
Sure. Well, I guess I could have one more perspective on this. I would say that progress looks like many people, many players figuring out how to make solutions happen. And at the level of individuals, that's how we live. Do we buy that Tesla? Do we bike to work? How do we vote? How do we invest? For companies, it's how do you protect the bottom line by really just increasing your preparedness for droughts and floods that are already happening? How do you think about being the business leaders of the next century and not tied to the opportunities of the past? For cities and states, it's really how do you use the opportunity of a smaller community to enable action happening so rapidly that suddenly the US or major companies can move forward. So I think it's all of these different actions coming together, not necessarily pretending that we know how rapid solutions are exactly going to be deployed, but really experimenting together and learning as we go.
Thank you for all the great questions, and let's thank our panel also for really good discussion.